Welcome to AONE Foundation Proposal Webinar Conference Call. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. I would like to now turn the call over to Danny Ward. You may begin.
Hello and good afternoon. I'm Danny Ward. I'm the Senior Donor Relations Specialist here at the AONE Foundation for Nursing Leadership, Research, and Education. And on behalf of the Foundation, thank you for attending today's webinar. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to take a minute and recognize and thank the Versant Center for the Advancement of Nursing for making these Sustainable Nursing Workforce Development grant opportunities possible. They gave a generous gift to the Foundation to do this. Our speakers today are both PhD prepared nurses from Oregon Health and Science University. Debbie and Jen, thank you both for sharing your time, knowledge, and expertise with us. And thank you too to the Oregon Health and Science University for its support of the Foundation in this webinar. Dr. Deborah Eldridge is a Director of Nursing Quality Research and Magnet Recognition at OHSU. Dr. Eldridge earned her MSN in Nursing Administration from the University of Rhode Island and her PhD in Nursing from the University of Rochester. She's a founding member of the Oregon Nursing Research and Quality Consortium, a regional group dedicated to improving nurses' interest in and ability to ask questions about their practice. Dr. Jennifer Mensick is a Division Director of Care Management at OHSU and earned her PhD in Nursing from the University of Arizona College of Nursing with a major focus in health systems and a minor in public administration from the Eller College of Management. Dr. Mensick is a national presenter and author of numerous books and articles and is an active blogger. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Debbie and Jen. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Danny, and thanks for inviting us to give this proposal.
Yep, and thank you. I'm very excited to be able to talk with everyone related to this and look forward to any questions afterwards.
My name is Debbie Eldridge. I'm the Director of Nursing Quality, as Danny said, at Oregon Health and Science University, and my colleague,
Jennifer Mensick, Division Director of Care Management, so happy to be here.
And I'll take the first part of the program, and Jennifer will close us out. So the objectives for today's presentation are really for you to be able to identify the key elements of a research proposal and to describe at least 2 tactics to help your proposal shine. We have many more tactics up our sleeve to share with you. I want to tell you a little bit about Oregon Health and Science University. It really looks like this today. It is a gorgeous late spring day here. It'll be a high of about 60 degrees. We sit on the top of a hill. On campus we have Dornbecker Children's Hospital, which is part of OHSU's 580 beds. We are twice magnet designated. Here's a picture of the tram that takes us to the bottom part of the campus, and in the distance is Mount Hood. We have about 29,000 hospital discharges per year. We do about 35,000 surgeries and about 50,000 emergency room visits. We're the state's first academic medical center, and we sit about 85% to 90% occupancy. So we heard about the opportunity or the need for some webinar education around how to write a proposal, and there's a lot of resources out there. And as we started putting our heads together about what's important, I think it's really important to understand why organizations have a request for proposal process. So all of the organizations want to invest in work that's relevant to their purposes, and almost all of these organizations will publish research priorities. And so it's their way of putting out the opportunity for the organization to draw research to help it answer its burning research platform. And on the other side, the applicants are really interested in earning resources to support a line of inquiry. And the small grants, the $10,000 to $5,000 grants, $15,000 grants, really provide a great opportunity for folks to get started with getting some grant funding. So this level of funding often attracts a lot of students, both PhD students and now a growing number of BNP students, as well as junior investigators and senior investigators. And then with the ongoing magnet interest in really being able to generate the next generation of nursing research, the American Nursing Association, ANCC, through the Magnet Recognition Program, has really increased their expectation about clinical research. And so that's going to make funding even more competitive than it already has been. So it's important to know when you're submitting a foundation grant who your competitors are, because you really want your project to shine. Probably one of the most important instructions, and this is true for many, many things, is we should follow the instructions. It sounds as though I remember trying to be creative and my dissertation chair saying that this is not the place to be creative, and it really isn't. An organization like AONE is going to get 50 applicants for one funding opportunity, and so the reviewers are going to cull out the things that don't meet the minimum requirements. So if your product is too long or too short, or you've gone really awry with headings, it's easy for a product to be disqualified. So you want to make sure you're adhering to page or word limits. Increasingly, I've seen things that call for character limits, and it's very hard to judge character limits, and so you have to write your product on another piece of paper and then sort of paste it in. You'll want to make sure that you submit really a de-identified version if that's requested, and this is really to help with the equity of the review process, to make sure that the science is what is driving the review, not necessarily the prestige of an organization. It will be important to understand the expectations or the timeline for IRB approval. In the olden days, you had to have IRB approval before you submitted grants, and most of the time now you have to have IRB approval before they'll release the funding, but you'll need to work with your IRB to understand what the timeline is internally. During the application process, this is a great time to ask questions of the sponsor. Most places want to answer questions because they want you to get it right, because they want to get the best science. So call up the sponsors and get your questions answered. It's essential to meet deadlines. Again, it's a hard line for disqualifying you. So sometimes people ask for a letter of interest in advance, and then after the letters of interest come in, people may be invited to write a formal proposal after that. You'll want to keep track of all of those deadlines. And lastly, for me, my challenge is always a little bit technology, so I always go on and get that submission software understood. I can put in fake information to just be able to advance the screen so I know what's coming up. That helps me prepare my document that lives on the side that I'm going to paste in as I'm ready to enter it into the software. So the critical elements of a proposal are pretty straightforward, and you want to use all of them to point out why you are the person who should get these funding. So introduction, background, you want to show the alignment with the funding priorities, and the AONE priorities were included in the most recent grant application opportunity. You'll want to include a conceptual model or a framework to really help guide your study. From there, you will draw your specific aims and a purpose statement. Then you'll have research designs and methods, and then most grants also want to see a timeline, a budget, and then some references. In addition, you have a couple other documents that you can use to help you be the right person for this funding opportunity. You want to get really enthusiastic letters of support that show you have access to the population, understanding about the IRB approval process. Your biosketch is another opportunity for that, to show that you have working relationships. And then most places also want you to declare about other funding. So I just wanted to move into the piece about really writing the research proposal as opposed to another kind of proposal. And thought this table really helped clarify some of the differences between research, evidence-based practice, and quality improvement. And the line, I mean, it's really a continuum amongst all of those. And most research proposals are really looking to generate research, generate new knowledge, which is going to be widely applicable and driven by theory. And so the purposes are really quite different between research, evidence-based practice, and quality improvement. I've seen a lot of people apply for research funding when they really have an evidence-based practice question. If we already know the answer, it's a matter of making us do it. The implementation side, it's probably not a research question. And so it's harder to find sources of funding for clinical inquiry, evidence-based practice, and performance improvement because they don't have the same funding opportunities. And I think the DNP students are helping this to get a blurrier line. For the AONE Foundation grant, they were very clear that they are looking to fund nursing research. And that would really be to develop a comprehensive understanding of a set of phenomenon, to generate new knowledge that can be applied in a variety of settings, driven by theory, where you can then test that theory. And when you have a theory that's been tested, you can use that to guide practice. And then again, the IRB always wants to know about research. Increasingly now, the editors are really wanting to make sure that human subjects have been protected, and so most places have some kind of an IRB query process to help determine if a full IRB is required, a determination process. So the title is probably not the first thing you're going to write as you sit down to draft your proposal, but it's going to make the first impression when the reviewers read it. So you really want to put your most important words first, use the outcome focus. You want to be clear in your title how far down a path you're going. As possible, you want to include the research priorities or the mission of the organization as part of the work that you're doing. It's a chance to make a good first impression, and if you oversell what you're doing in the title, people will be disappointed, and if you undersell what you're doing in the title, people may not follow all the way to the end. So it's really that most important 12, maybe 10, maybe 15 words that will tell the best picture of your project. The next section is the introduction and significance, and in this part of the proposal, you'll want to have a clear statement of the problem. You'll talk about the purpose and the significance of the work. Oftentimes these will start with some statistics where they talk about heart failure is the most common readmission. It costs X amount per admission. It's X number of people are involved, and family caregivers have to do the work. Therefore, it's really important we understand family caregiving in relation to heart failure. You'll want to find a reason to hook your audience in pretty quickly. Your funders want you to hook in to the priorities. So here are the research priorities from the AONE Foundation. Again, they were part of the proposal application that people got to build their projects from. So you want to make sure that you align your work with the with one of these priorities so that the reviewers don't have to guess which one you're really working on. You want to make that very clear for them. So as you have your introduction and significance, you've pointed people in the right direction, then you're really going to build that background, that review of literature. And this is your chance in somewhere, depending on the length of your grant proposal, somewhere between 2 paragraphs and 3 pages. You really want to make sure that you can demonstrate that you already know what's already known about your topic. So you want to have the current literature, the classic literature, the seminal literature included in your references. You will want to build from what's known to what isn't yet known, and there may be many things that are not yet known. You want to clarify which one gap you want to study next. So you're really trying to narrow from that broad perspective of here's everything we know about shared governance in nursing and empowerment, down to what your particular question is. And oftentimes, I help students come up with that one sentence of their problem statement. So it's that super short elevator speech where somebody says, "What are you doing this year?" This is what I'm trying to investigate. Probably not the first sentence you're going to write. It's one that you write over and over as your ideas get clarified. But it's really an important component of the background. The next piece of the background is really the work that you bring to this line of inquiry. So most successful proposals, even at the $5,000 and $10,000 level, should build on work that's already underway. These could be student projects, these can be small investigations done somewhere that you can demonstrate that you have a familiarity with the population, with your theoretical approach, with a method, that you have a team of folks who can help. This can be clinician teams, academic teams, statistician, community entree folks. And of particular importance is the ability to disseminate, or the history of having disseminated those results. Funders really want to know that their work is going to make a difference, and one of the ways people demonstrate that is really looking at what that dissemination looks like. So it's great to give presentations. They don't count nearly as much as the publication does. And so it's really worth your time to invest in some of your preliminary work because it provides a nice track record of the work that will follow. So as you build your background and preliminary studies, I find it super helpful to organize my thoughts in terms of a conceptual model. This is a way to help develop that scientific body of knowledge to really guide practice. The conceptual model is going to identify, label, and clarify the phenomenon, so what's really important within nursing or within a patient care population. It provides a way to really grow those next theoretical postulates. So if A is related to B, if I can improve A, I should therefore be able to improve B. If I'm talking in terms of a set of well-defined terms, it's easier for people to see what that work means for their own application pieces. So the theory really provides that continuity piece. It's going to organize the thinking, the observations, your interpretation, help provide rationale for why you're doing certain things. And the fun part about a conceptual framework is it's pretty visual, and then people can find the parts that that are most important. And so when you have the picture, then you want to make sure that you're speaking about your constructs in the review of literature and in your preliminary studies in terms of what you see in the conceptual model, and then you'll use these same terms as you build the operational model for the actual investigation. This part, you're still setting up why this is the right question right now and why you have the right approach. So here's another conceptual model of work engagement. From this diagram, it would look as though you could see that job resources and personal resources go back and forth. If we can adjust job resources, that may help adjust the personal resources. When I think about engaging staff in work, if we can get better work engagement, this would hypothesize that we would then have better job performance. As you build your model, then you're going to have your research questions, which should flow logically from your conceptual model. You could have a descriptive research study where you're really just trying to identify or describe one or two phenomenon. You could propose questions that look to determine differences between groups. Those could be well-defined groups or potentially partially defined groups as you are trying to investigate that. And then you could really look to understand relationships between phenomenon that might be related in a systematic way. From the research questions, then you would build more specific hypotheses. And the hypothesis is really your best prediction about what you would expect to happen in the study. It's going to include the variables and any of the relationships, who's being studied, the type of research, if it's descriptive or experimental, and it really helps direct how you're going to measure the things and interpret the findings. And then the findings of your study either support or don't support or fail to support the hypothesis, depending on how mathematically you want to interpret the null hypothesis. So the null hypothesis basically will say there's no relationship between the variables. You often want to disprove that because you're trying to demonstrate there is a relationship, and that would be an alternative hypothesis. I often recommend people poke at directional hypotheses because it will give us some theoretical reason why something should improve or not improve that predicts the relationship. It also comes in really handy for the analysis part where you can put all of your statistical probability on one side. It helps it easier to detect a difference if there is one, or a non-directional hypothesis from there. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer, and she's going to pick up with the next parts of the method section.
Yay. So, and I want to reiterate, too, that each one of these sections that Deb and I are talking about, even though they're unique, they build off of each other and should be a consistent thread throughout each one of them. So as someone's reading, your definitions don't change, your model doesn't change, your problem statement doesn't change. It really is very, very consistent because you're trying to build the strongest proposal because you want to be funded. So if there is any question or inconsistencies, your proposal is already going to have issues in the eyes of the reviewer. So now that you've looked at your questions and your aims, and hypothesis, your conceptual model, who is your population and what is your sample? And it's really important to know, who are you going to study? Are these all ICU nurses? Are these all nurses in critical access hospitals? Are these all home care nurses? You need to look at the population as a whole of who you're studying, or nurse managers. Are you looking at all charge nurses? So you should actually very carefully define who your population is and who's going to be included and excluded. Are you going to include all male and female charge nurses? Are you going to exclude anybody who has less than 1 year of experience? So you want to be very specific about who this population is, because what you're doing in building your strong proposal is we want to know, the foundation wants to know, can this information be generalized to the larger population? Again, this is the difference between research and an evidence-based practice, is that generalization to the larger population. Could the hospital down the street take the data that we found and put it into play in their organization? It's not specific only to our organization. So from that population, you're going to narrow down, how are you going to get your sample? You can't study everybody in the population. You can only afford to study a certain amount of those people. The strongest designs have a random or probability sampling that anybody in your population could have participated in your study, and so they all had an equal likelihood of being able to participate. A lot of times it's much easier to get a convenient sample, like, hey, I'm the CNO and we're going to study all my units in the hospital. That's a convenient sample. So how is that going to generalize to the larger population of other hospitals or organizations? So you really do want to be specific about your population, and then how are you going to sample so that your sample helps provide a strong study, and also is generalizable to other hospitals, other healthcare organizations, and other places. Quite often, this is very important with the variables, because variables are and should very well be tied into your conceptual framework. So if you're looking at job performance or work engagement based on your conceptual framework, how does that theory or those articles define job performance? How did they define work engagement? You want to go back to the literature and pull definitions, because when you look at your variables, whether it's dependent or your independent variable, you want to make sure that how you're defining it is supported by the literature that you read. Again, it's consistency across the proposal. If you have a reason for changing the definition, you're going to want to be clear about why your variable might be a little bit different, because the next step is we're going to want to measure these variables, and how you define it impacts how you're going to measure and analyze this. So you're going to want to call out what your dependent variables are. You might have more than one, and what your outcome variable is, or your independent variable. So what we also are doing with this whole process is because we want to generalize, we're trying to decrease extraneous variables. So with that stronger sampling perspective, with the conceptual framework, with the hypothesis, we're really trying to decrease. We want to know that whatever we're studying is in fact making the outcome that we see in our statistical analysis. And it's not some other variable that we didn't happen to study. So we want to decrease the likelihood of some extraneous variable being that potential issue, because we're not studying, we didn't look at it. You do want to call out or note that there's always going to be an extraneous variable, but your design and how you set up this entire proposal should be to help decrease that outside influence on your study. Study-wise, quasi-experimental and experimental designs are the strongest way to control for those extraneous variables. So when you're looking at what design as well, you're going to look towards, is quasi-experimental or experimental appropriate for what I'm doing? Which then leads into your measurement plan. So if you've named your variables, you've defined them, you've looked at your conceptual model, how are you going to measure these? Quite often, we will see individuals who will create their own questionnaire and write their own questions. Do not do that. This is where those preliminary studies. Instrumentation or building an instrument is in and of itself its own research study. And so this is not necessarily the place to actually create an instrument. So that should have been done in one of those preliminary studies. Use an instrument that's already measuring one of your variables that's already published, and you can quote the validity and the reliability statistics from it. So if you're looking at job satisfaction or nursing empowerment, structural empowerment, there are instruments that are already out there that measure these items that are reliable and valid. So do use those instruments. Now, some of those things do cost, but again, you're writing a proposal, so those are things that you might put into your budget to be able to pay for, to be able to use those instruments that might cost some money. You might be looking at direct measurements, so you're going to note everything that you're measuring. If you were looking at a person, you might measure height and weight, but you also might look at overtime. You could be looking at a lot of different factors. So direct measurement is something solid, like height and weight, that you can measure that's tangible. Indirect concepts are things like nurse satisfaction, work engagement, things that would need questionnaires for, but you want to be very specific. How are you going to measure those variables? Because those are the pieces of data that you must use to analyze statistically. Garbage in, garbage out. You need to be very clear in this process because you don't want to collect data that you're not going to be able to analyze correctly. Nothing would be worse. And as people are reviewing the study, they're going to see that you won't be able to analyze as you planned based on how you are collecting your data and what data you are collecting. Again, this goes right through consistency across the board. With data collection, how are you gathering this information? Who's gathering this information? Who's trained to gather this information? Are you gathering the information, or have you taught a few other people on the research team to gather information? Over what period of time are you gathering this information? Is it through interview processes? They might have the open-ended questions. Is it very much structured reports, like a Likert scale? So, how are you collecting this data in a very systematic manner? How are you protecting the data, too? Because IRB is going to want to know what you're doing with all this data that you're collecting. It always needs to be locked up and placed in a secure spot because you're protecting identity of the individual. So if it's a patient-related information, of course, you're going to protect it. You're also going to collect, the nurse's data or the manager's data. So now we're getting to the statistical analysis. And at this level of funding, you're going to want to be able to use both descriptive and inferential statistics to be able to analyze your data. So why do we use statistics? Well, we're taking this large amount of information and trying to funnel it down to something useful that we can communicate really, really easy to another person, another organization, in a journal, in a presentation, so that they can take it and apply it in their organization as well. So here, when we're looking at the people who are on your team and looking at the budget, if you had a bad experience with statistics in your schooling, this is where you're definitely going to want to bring a statistician or someone with good statistical expertise onto your team so that they can help you analyze the data. And even before, you're going to want them to look at this proposal and be part of this proposal building, because they're going to help you understand what tests you can and cannot do based on the data that you think you're going to collect. And they might help you say, if you want to do this, you should collect the data this way so that we can analyze it in a different way. Many people make a mistake that they only use the statistician after they collect the data, when they need to get that statistician on board now with that proposal building so that they can actually make sure they're collecting the right data that they say they're going to, that's going to get them the information that they can analyze correctly. And for those, just as a reminder, statistical analysis, descriptive data is, means, median, modes, which is nice data, but it's not always useful. So we're basically describing the sample, describing the organization, not necessarily always applicable. And that doesn't tell us if there's something related or correlated or what kind of relationship we have between variables. That's where you're going to go into inferential statistics. That statistician can help you with the power analysis to tell you what your sample size should be. It's not going to be we're going to collect all of the data from all the nurses on the unit. How many nurses do you need data from? How many nurse managers do you need data from? That power analysis will help you determine how many people you do need to have in your sample size, and then also then be able to then do those tests appropriately to help us get hopefully statistically significant results, because that's what you're looking for. Timeline-wise, Keep in mind, a lot of people want to solve world peace with their proposal. And you really want to think about this from, I'm going to, put one brick on the wall of research, and I'm going to stick to my one area and be very focused and do it really, really well. And if you try to squeeze too much in, you're not going to get done within the time frame. The AONE grant is a $50,000 grant awarded up for a 2-year period. The smaller grants are for 1 year for 12 months. So really think about what you absolutely can do in the time and with the budget you are requesting. If you do get too much going on, you are just going to run out of time and run out of funding to be able to pay for individuals. So you definitely want to take into consideration it's probably going to take you longer than you anticipate to get IRB approval, to get questionnaires back, to survey people. There's lots of little things that occur during a timeline perspective. So this is kind of like a sample timeline to give you a perspective for, of things that you need to kind of map out and say, here's when we plan to do these, so that you can put this on paper so that you can see for yourself what this looks like, and including too that final draft of that results back to AONE to let them know what you found in your proposal. Budget. It's really important to note that AONE grant funding does not pay for indirect costs, for those who are wondering. It also does not pay for the investigator time, but it would pay for other individuals' time, such as consultants and the statistician. The purpose of the budget is to, really to justify all the expenses. If you're looking for $50,000, $45,000 shouldn't be in iPhone watches. So this really is looking at what do you need, what are you collecting, and really this is probably more focused on people time, consultant time, money used for the instruments if you need to purchase a copyright for instrument usage, travel for conferences, and how are you going to disseminate this knowledge. So there's a lot of pieces to that budget. Supplies, copying costs. So really think about everything that you're going to need. Are you going to give people $5 Starbucks gift cards? So how does that look, and how much are you going to spend? And then also you really note to describe the level of effort for a statistician. So if you're saying you're going to pay a statistician $5,000, what level of effort is that for that person? If they're a full-time employee, is that 1% of their time for the year or whatever? This is a sample budget overall. Note in there they have the PI, the investigator's time, but in the AONE you would not put that. But you would put other people's times, equipment, travel, some other things in there to help you make sure. So this is not just, you need to be as specific as possible when you're noting this information. Travel budget too, so you do want to even be really careful. So you can put in there for travel. So if you're going to go to AONE to present this, one person for 2 hotel night stay, what is the cost of airfare? So you want to be very specific and come down with a really good number. That's not just a good guesstimate. This should be pretty accurate. In addition, we talked a little bit about IRB approval on the beginning, and this is going to take some time, because if this is real, if you're doing research, you're more than likely not going to get an exempt stamp of approval. So there are 3 different types of approvals from IRB. Exempt meaning pretty much minimal harm. Usually EBP falls into exempt if you have to get IRB approval. Exempt takes the least amount of time. Full reviews could take a couple of months to get approval. So depending on the inherent risk that the committee thinks that your proposal might have on whoever you're studying, there might be some back and forth conversation about your proposal and tweaking a few little things to make sure that you are protecting human subjects. There are many ways to get human subjects protection. Some hospitals have their own internal IRB. If you work in an academic medical center or a university, obviously the university has an IRB process. But if you have neither one of those, there are many independent IRBs that are recognized by the federal government to be able to give IRB approval. This is not a hospital subcommittee. This is a federally protected entity that is upholding federal standards. So you do need to have a letter from your IRB saying that it was approved for you to go forward before you will get your funding from AONE. You don't have to have it prior to submission, but you're going to need to have it before you start and get your money. References. We talked a little bit about references, but cannot overstate the importance of your references, your bibliography. I have read articles or peer-reviewed information before, and it has been clear that they were doing a quick review of the literature and missed out on very key pieces of the literature, which would have informed their study a little bit differently. So the reason why you want to be able to demonstrate that you know the literature and look at because when I look at your reference list or someone looks at your reference list, it's very clear that you have read the knowledge, you've taken that into consideration building this proposal. This is not about necessarily duplicating something, but this is about building on prior research, prior knowledge, creating new knowledge on top of prior knowledge. That brick fence, you're putting another brick on top of the fence wall. But if you haven't cited certain individuals in an area, people will question whether you have the expertise to do what you're going to do, what you're proposing to do in your proposal. So references should not be an afterthought. This should be very clear. Have a librarian help you in search. You should be very knowledgeable about this area that you are proposing to spend a lot of money on to study. You're going to cite publications that are current and relevant. Articles should be no older than 5 to 7 years, except if they're sentinel articles. If you are citing someone from 30 years ago who was the person who found certain types of information, or the original study 30 years ago, that's perfectly fine. People who are reading your proposal will know if those are sentinel articles or not, or if you just were lazy, for lack of better words, on really not looking at all the current references or keeping up on material. So make sure that, if you can have sentinel articles, but make sure most of your literature is the absolute most current literature. And then you're going to have your CV or your biosketch. And do not just attach what you have sitting on your file that you used for your last job application, because that is not going to work necessarily. Your biosketch CV should be always reworked when you submit for the reason you're submitting it for. In this perspective, you are submitting it to support your expertise and your team's expertise related to the ability to get this research done. So we're looking at everyone on your team. Do you have the people that are needed on the team? It's just not you. Do you have the people on the team all together who will be able to get this done and be successful? What are the articles that each person has published? What other studies have they been a participant of? This shouldn't be that these were my friends who said this was a great idea and we're all going to join in together. You are very clear that everybody on this team is contributing and they have a certain role to play on your proposal to help ensure this is successful. And with that, I want to note there is a ton of resources out there, like we said. So the NIH, this is not an NIH grant, but the NIH does have a lot of information, particularly about creating budgets and just different pieces of a proposal. So if you're really interested in understanding even more about it, go through the NIH to get their perspective of information. And of course, this last article about conceptual frameworks, because don't just find one to say this is ours. When you have a conceptual framework, it is threaded throughout your entire proposal. It doesn't look like that you just picked it because you needed one. That this really is building part of the building of the knowledge. So with that, I guess we have questions.
It looks like there's a question that came in while we were speaking earlier about how to write a qualitative study to understand the phenomenon. And I'm a quantitative person. Remember the big quant, little quant? I'm on the big quant side. So, this is definitely where you're going to have conversation with someone who is a qualitative researcher expertise. So, so Laura, so what you're going to want to do is, what are you looking for? There's, 3 main categories of qualitative: ethnography, phenomenology, and grounded theory. What is your intent? And then go talk to someone who can help you understand which of those methodologies this is, and then go find someone to add to your team who is knowledgeable in that. So you're going to
most likely not find one person who's really knowledgeable in all three. You're going to find one person who does really well with grounded theory, one person who might do really good with phenomenology or ethnography, and you're going to add that person to your team and help and bring them in to help develop how you're doing this, because with some qualitative, you're not going to have a conceptual framework up front. Your lit review is going to look very different based on your qualitative methodology. And so, but you're going to be very clear what type of qualitative methodology you're doing and why your pieces of this proposal are going to look a little bit differently. You're going to spend a lot of time with paying someone. You're going to have someone probably type up transcripts. So you're going to have someone listening to transcripts, typing up transcripts, someone to help you go through. You're still going to have probably you're going to have software. There's qualitative software to look at and analyze concepts. So you're going to have a lot of the same pieces, but I would be so you may not have the statistician, but you're going to have someone you're going to pay who's going to be an expert in one of those three main qualitative areas. This shouldn't be descriptive study. Descriptive is not in and of itself a qualitative method. You're going to pick one of those three main buckets and focus in.
It's probably a reasonable time to throw in one of those little rules about any research project. Is the question should drive the method and not the method driving the question. So in the review of literature, you would set up what's known in general, and then you'd end up with what you want to know. And then from there, if it's a qualitative approach, because there's not enough theory, there's no theory around why a phenomenon that you've been observing is happening, it's time to build that theory. You would take a grounded theory approach. If it's a group of people having experience that hasn't been well identified, you use an ethnographic approach. What's similar between a quantitative proposal and a qualitative proposal is you have to do all the pieces. The guts of the methods look different. You're going to sample your folks differently. You're going to manage your data differently. But the reviewers still want to know that you have a plan to sample, a plan to collect your data, a plan to validate your data, a plan to analyze the data, a plan to disseminate the data. So much of that is the same between the two different approaches to how you would do research questions.
And qualitative shouldn't be thought of as less by any means. Where we are today with Magnet is because of the early qualitative studies in the 80s. And so, a lot of good qualitative studies really move eventually into more quantitative and types of research projects. So there's a lot to be learned still with qualitative.
Yeah. All right. You're welcome. You're welcome, Laura, for that asking us a good question.
What other questions do we have out there?
So I'm not sure whether if people are typing. Great. It's always nice to see that. Someone's typing us a question. Go ahead and use your chat feature. We'll happily answer most questions.
It's very nice because it has those little 3-dot buttons so we can see someone's typing.
So someone mentioned a question around instrumentation and would an organization fund a validation study? I would say sure. Lots of the small grants would be sort of the appropriate level of funding to develop a new instrument. When I was doing my postdoctoral project, there were 2 people whose entire PhD was really developing a good measure. So to really get all those pieces to describe the content, to do the content validity pieces, to see what you can do in terms of discriminant validity, all of those pieces are important, and they do take a study to do well. And so you can certainly create a proposal as a psychometric study to really understand how an instrument performs. You sure want to demonstrate that before anyone's going to give you more money to see if that instrument is really working or not working. You want to get some of that stuff done ahead of time.
And you're going to want to make sure you have someone on your team that knows how to do instrumentation and is proven, because instrumentation is almost its own method. It's very detailed. Lots of knowledge goes into being able to do instrumentation correctly.
And really fun. I mean, one of the most fun things to do is a factor analysis, and you can really try and see how your questions might be related. But there's a lot of statistics involved in doing a good instrument study, and so you want to have the right team assembled to do that. We have another question about the 3 types of IRB approval. One of them was exempt.
And then on the other end is full, and the middle.
In between is expedited.
Expedited.
And so in an expedited study, the IRB says, essentially, we have purview over this work, but because the level of risk is relatively low, we will expedite it and doesn't require the full board review. So an exempt study is one that doesn't trigger research, data collected for non-research purposes, some of those kinds of things. Expedited is when you're doing a really low-risk study. For us, it's a single blood draw, a survey question, something like that. But then we use a full board review. Anytime you're retaining data in any kind of a database, any kind of intervention study requires a full board review.
Qualitative data usually lends to a full board review automatically.
Right, just because of the opportunities for that relationship between the researcher and the subjects to get goofy, to make sure that the investigators have put the right protections in place.
Yep.
Great question.
Full board reviews take much longer. It could take a couple of months to get a full board review.
Especially if they have questions. We could do a whole workshop on how to make the IRB hum. My best advice about the IRB is go make an IRB friend so that you always have a phone a friend in the IRB.
Great questions. Any other questions out there?
Oh, someone else is typing for us. Will you get slides? I'm going to leave that question to Danny. From our perspective, absolutely. I'm not sure how AONE makes them available. Happily share them.
We are going to be having a recording available, and since you are willing to share slides, we can absolutely share them with the attendees.
Okay, great. Someone wrote a question about whether or not nursing organizations will fund interprofessional studies, and I think the answer for this is yes with 2 exclamation points. I think those organizations, the Oncology Nursing Society, the Association of OR Nurses, want to fund interprofessional work because it takes interprofessional work to get that mission accomplished. So you just have to make sure the agency is clear. In terms of the AONE in particular, I didn't see anything that excluded interprofessional research, so maybe that's a question we'll defer to Danny.
And keeping in mind too, if you're meeting the intent of what their areas of funding are, you should be perfectly fine. So always align it with the areas of funding.
I was just going to say the exact same thing. As long as it fits in our priorities, we do focus on nursing leadership, but we do also recognize that interprofessional is completely essential and is going to become more important as we go forward. So, as long as you meet one of our priorities, it's definitely fair game.
I would say that most funding agencies will be clear about what they absolutely will and absolutely won't do. So they won't fund computer software, or they won't fund computers anymore. So they'll be pretty clear. Most guidelines are pretty clear. I would say in more places I've seen a restriction to make sure you have an interprofessional team, as opposed to making sure it's only a nursing team. Yeah.
And then again, making sure you've got those appropriate disciplines represented on your team.
Absolutely. Great. All righty. Oh, great. Another question. I don't know if you guys can see the little questions. They're sort of fun.
It's like someone's texting us. Little bubbles show up. Well, thank you.
Oh,
Thank you for the compliment.
All right.
Yeah, this is, this was tough because there's so much detail that goes into each slide that's behind the slide. So it's a lot more that could be said.
I guess the other piece is sort of maybe in closing is to think about how writing a proposal is like writing anything. It's really an iterative process. And so you make a start, you get some feedback, you do something else, you go get some more feedback, you read a different article, you find a different way to measure something, you go somewhere else, get a little slice of something done somewhere that's preliminary data, then you show back up with the same sort of iterative process. You can build a lot of teams along the way, teams in the academic world can be pretty small, so you want to make sure you are a good team member yourself. But these teams have done a lot. I've been able to do a lot in the long term because of team research projects.
Yep. We've got another question coming.
Is funding continuous? Is there a cutoff date as before for this fund? When I looked at the funding requirements for this particular AONE grant, the small grants were a one-year funding, and you get all the money at the same time. The 2-year, the $50,000 grants where you get $25,000 the first year and $25,000 the second year. In most situations, you're able to ask for a no-cost extension if you don't need any additional money, but you didn't get the last penny spent before the end of the funding cycle. Most places will give somewhere between a 3 and 6 month no-cost extension, as long as you have a pretty good plan for what you're doing. Sometimes those delays happen because of long IRB approvals or slow data collection or population availability. What I meant, is there a due date?
There is a due date for the AONE proposal, and I think Danny can speak to that.
Yes. These proposals are due July 2nd by 3 o'clock p.m. Central Time. So it is pretty specific. July 2nd, 3 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Okay, which is 1 p.m. West Coast time and 4 p.m. East Coast time.
And then you'll be able to join the 4th of July without...
Yes, it'll be off your plate.
Off your plate.
Well, thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. Debbie or Jen, do you have any final thoughts? If you haven't any last questions, please do feel free to pop them into the chat.
Good luck.
Yeah, we look forward to reading them because we both serve as reviewers for small granting agencies. So in the blinded review, we never know. We don't want to know who you are. We always want to know that we're reading solid proposals. So work on them, use that iterative thinking and writing process. It's going to strengthen your proposal and your team as you answer those questions, as you try and problem solve it in your writing.
This is not easy work.
Not easy.
If we were in person, I'd be beginning a round of applause for both of you. Thank you so much, Debbie and Jen. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, well, and go URI Rams, basketball season.
Yeah.
That's when the Rams have any hope of shining. This is fun, and I appreciate everyone being online for this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for joining us and asking some great questions.
Yes, thank you all for attending. As I mentioned, we will be making the recording available, and we will also make the slides available. If you have any other questions or want to talk through some ideas or brainstorm, you can do that with me, Danny Ward at the AONE Foundation. I'm going to put my email address in the chat box right now, but most of you already have it. And we hope you have a wonderful rest of your afternoon, and we look forward to seeing your submissions by July 2nd at 3 o'clock p.m. Central Standard Time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This concludes today's conference call. Thank you for attending.